I had $42 million sitting quietly in accounts my daughter didn't know existed, and she looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off the bottom of her shoe. Not once. Not twice. Every single time she walked through the door of my house, which she had started calling the old place, as if the 40 years I'd spent building it were an embarrassment to her new life. Her husband stood behind her like a shadow that had learned to wear a blazer, nodding at everything she said, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, and looking at my bookshelves the way a man looks at a yard sale. My name is Walter Pruitt. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a cold storage and distribution network across the southeastern United States, starting with one leased refrigerated truck in Macon, Georgia, and ending with a portfolio of 11 climate-controlled warehouses that served every major grocery chain from Virginia to Louisiana. I sold the operating company 8 years ago, but kept the real estate, the land, the buildings, the leases. The income comes in every month like clockwork, and it has since the day I signed the sale agreement. My daughter does not know any of this. She knows I used to work in food distribution. She thinks I've sold the business and spent the money. She sees the house I live in, a modest 3-bedroom rancher on the outskirts of Savannah that I bought in 1987 and never upgraded because I never needed to, and she has decided that it tells the whole story. My daughter looks at the house and sees a man who ran out of road. She looks at my truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it, and she sees a man who never amounted to much. She looks at me in my jeans and my fishing shirts and my boots that are soft at the heel, and she sees a burden she hasn't figured out how to put down yet. Her husband's name is Cliff. He sells something related to insurance, though every time I ask him to explain it, the explanation changes. He wears cologne I can smell from across the room and shoes that cost more than my monthly electric bill. He calls me Walt in a way that sounds like he is doing me a favor. They live 40 minutes away in a subdivision called Briar Crest Landing, in a house that is too large for 2 people and decorated in a style that looks like it was assembled from a catalog for people who want other people to think they have taste. My daughter's name is Renee. She is 38 years old. She has her mother's cheekbones and her mother's temper, and none of her mother's patience. My wife, Beverly, passed 11 years ago from pancreatic cancer. She went fast, which the doctors said was a mercy, and which I still haven't decided how I feel about. We had 2 children, Renee and my son Marcus, who lives in Portland now and calls me every Sunday without fail. Marcus is steady. Marcus is the kind of man who asks how you're doing and then waits for the actual answer. Renee has never been that person, even as a girl. The trouble started the year Cliff lost his position at the regional office of whatever it was he sold. He came home one Tuesday afternoon, and by Thursday they were sitting in my living room telling me about it. I remember Renee didn't ask how I was doing or comment on the garden or say anything about the sweet tea I'd set out. She sat on the edge of my couch like she was afraid the cushions might stain her slacks, and told me that Cliff was going to be starting his own independent practice, that it was actually a great opportunity, that the income might be irregular for a while. I asked her what she needed. She said she didn't need anything. She said she was just keeping me informed. Then she spent the next hour explaining why they couldn't cut back on the house payments. The 2 car leases, the gym membership Cliff never used, and the vacation they had already booked to Cancun that October. She went through every expense the way a lawyer reads a will, making sure I understood the full weight of each one before moving to the next. I listened. I said I hoped Cliff's new venture went well. I meant it. I walked them to the door and watched them pull out of my driveway in a car that was leased under terms I knew they couldn't sustain, and I went back inside and drank my tea. That was 14 months before the night my son-in-law pulled me aside at Renee's birthday dinner and asked if I had anything saved up. The dinner was at their house. Renee had a thing about restaurants, always had, some anxiety about menus and noise, so they hosted. They'd invited 4 other couples, all from the neighborhood, people with the same haircuts and the same opinions about the same television shows. I arrived with a card and a bottle of wine I'd picked out carefully, a California Cabernet I'd read about and thought she'd like. Cliff took it from me at the door, glanced at the label, and set it on the counter in the kitchen without comment. They served something from a case Cliff had picked up that had a glossy label and tasted like furniture polish. I ate my dinner. I talked to the people next to me. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, but I noticed things. I noticed the way Renee introduced me to her friends. Not as her father, but as my dad, Walt, he's retired. Said it the way you'd describe a piece of furniture that's been in the family too long to throw out, but doesn't really go with anything. I noticed that when one of the other guests asked what I'd retired from, Renee answered before I could. Distribution, she said, in a voice that closed the subject. After dinner, when the other guests were in the living room, Cliff found me in the hallway and steered me toward the back porch, with a hand on my shoulder that was steering and not friendly. He closed the sliding door behind us. He asked me about my finances in the way men do when they've been rehearsing it, starting casual and then getting to the point too fast. He told me they were having a cash flow issue. He said it was temporary. He said he had a client, a man named Devin, who ran a private investment fund specializing in short-term commercial real estate lending, and that Devin was offering a very limited opportunity to qualified investors, 18% annually, backed by hard assets, completely secured. He said Devin had been doing this for years and had never missed a payment to an investor. I asked how much he was putting in. Cliff looked at the backyard and said they were going in heavy because they believed in it. I asked where the money was coming from, if they were having a cash flow issue. He looked at me then with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a man who has already spent the money in his head and is now working backward to find it. He said they were taking a second position on the house. He said the equity was sitting there doing nothing, and this was a way to put it to work. Then he said he thought I might want to get in too. He said Devin could probably make an exception and let me in at a lower entry point, given the family connection. I said I'd think about it. He said I shouldn't wait too long. I went back inside and spent 20 minutes talking to a woman named Arlene, who had strong feelings about hybrid tomatoes, and then I said goodnight to Renee, who hugged me the way you hug a mailman, and I drove home. I did not go to bed when I got home. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything Cliff had said. 18% annually, hard assets, Devin, short-term commercial lending, limited opportunity. I have been in business long enough to know that when a person uses all of those phrases in the same pitch, they are either lying or they are about to be robbed. I called a man named Theodore Ames the next morning. Theodore had been my corporate attorney for 19 years and had the kind of mind that could smell a bad deal through a telephone line. I described what Cliff had told me. Theodore was quiet for a moment and then said, "Walter, that is either the most optimistic idiot in Georgia or a Ponzi scheme." He told me to stay away from it. I told him I already planned to. Then I told him something else. I told him I thought it was time to take certain steps I'd been putting off. Theodore understood what I meant. We had discussed it before, in general terms. He said he'd draw up the paperwork. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched my son-in-law the way I used to watch the weather in hurricane season, distant but attentive. I didn't call Renee. I didn't stop by. I let the silence sit and watched to see what filled it. What filled it was a text from Renee 6 weeks after the birthday dinner, asking if I had a minute to talk. Not a call, a text. I said sure and waited. The call came that evening and she didn't warm up to it. She told me Cliff's new practice was taking longer to generate income than expected. She told me the house payment was a concern. She said she hated to ask, but she was wondering if I had any liquid savings I might be willing to contribute to the family situation, just temporarily, just to get them through the next few months until Devin's fund started paying out. I asked her how much they'd put into Devin's fund. There was a pause. She said a significant amount. I asked what significant meant. She said the equity from the second mortgage, plus Cliff's retirement account, plus some personal loans from 2 of Cliff's friends. I told her I didn't have much in the way of liquid savings. She said she knew it wasn't much, but even a small amount would help. I said I'd see what I could do. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I let it float. What I actually did was call Theodore back and tell him to accelerate the paperwork. I also called a private investigator I'd used twice before for business purposes, a quiet, precise woman named Doris, and I asked her to look into Devin and his fund. Doris came back to me in 10 days with a file that was not surprising, but was still difficult to read. Devin's fund had no verified real estate holdings. The hard assets Cliff had described did not exist in any public record. Devin had operated under 3 different business names in the previous 8 years, twice in Florida and once in Tennessee. In Florida, he had been the subject of a civil suit that settled out of court. In Tennessee, he had simply disappeared for 18 months before resurfacing in Georgia under a new name and a new entity. The SEC had an open inquiry. I sat with that file for a long time, Then I went to see Renee and Cliff. I drove to Briarcrest Landing on a Saturday morning. Cliff opened the door in gym clothes he hadn't sweated in. Renee appeared behind him with coffee and the particular tight around the eyes look she gets when she's been arguing. I sat at their kitchen island and I told them what Doris had found. I told them about the Florida suit. I told them about Tennessee. I told them about the SEC inquiry. I put the printed pages on the granite countertop and pushed them across. Cliff picked them up. He read them in the way people read documents when they are looking for reasons to dismiss them. He set them back down. He said Doris must have the wrong Devon. He said there were a lot of people with that name. He said Devon had investors all over Atlanta, and no one had ever had a problem. I told him I thought he should pull the money out before the fund distributed anything, and before the inquiry went further. Cliff told me Devon had already warned him that jealous people might try to interfere. He said Devon had told all his investors to expect this kind of thing as the fund grew. He said I clearly didn't understand how private capital markets worked. Renee didn't say anything during this. She looked at the pages. She looked at Cliff. She looked at the window. When I stood up to leave, she followed me to the door and said quietly that she hoped I wasn't doing this because I didn't want them to succeed. I drove home. I did not answer that. 6 weeks later, Devon disappeared. He didn't close his office or send a letter. The fund's website went dark on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the phones were going to voicemail. By Saturday, Cliff had driven to the office address and found a commercial suite with a different company's name on the door. Devon had been subletting a single room and was gone. Cliff lost everything he had put in. His 2 friends lost their money. The second mortgage on the house was due regardless. The retirement account was gone. Renee called me the night they found out the office was empty. She was crying in a way I hadn't heard since her mother's funeral, deep and without self-consciousness, the kind of crying that means something has actually broken. I listened. I said I was sorry. I meant that too. Whatever Cliff had done, my daughter was in pain, and I was not going to enjoy that. But I also did not offer to fix it. Not yet. I had learned something, you see. When you rescue people too quickly, they don't learn what put them there. They learn that there's always a net below them, and they start to lean into the falls. What I did do, quietly, was what Theodore had prepared. I finalized the paperwork for a new holding entity called Pruitt Land and Lease, LLC. I transferred the warehouse properties into it. I updated the estate documents. I set up a separate trust for Marcus's children, my 2 grandchildren out in Portland. And I did one more thing, something I had been thinking about, since the night Cliff described Devon's pitch on the back porch. I contacted the mortgage servicer on Renee and Cliff's house. I asked if the second position note was available for purchase. It was a distressed note. The servicer knew the underlying borrowers were in trouble, and they were willing to move it. I bought it through Pruitt Land and Lease at a discount. Renee and Cliff did not know this. As far as they knew, they owed money to a faceless financial institution in Charlotte. They didn't know that the institution had sold the note. They didn't know who held it now. 3 months passed. Cliff found part-time work consulting for a man he knew from a previous job. Renee picked up hours at a friend's interior design business, mostly administrative, but she didn't complain about it, which told me something about how scared she was. They stopped going out to dinner with their neighbors. The Cancun trip they'd been planning got quietly dropped. These were small signs that reality was arriving. Then Cliff stopped making payments on the 2nd. It went 1 month, then 2. On the 3rd month, Theodore sent a formal notice of default from Pruitt Land and Lease. It was courteous but unambiguous. It stated the amount owed, the delinquency, and the timeline for resolution before the note holder exercised its right to foreclose. Cliff called the number on the letterhead and got Theodore's paralegal, who was professional and gave him nothing. He tried to find out who owned the entity. Georgia LLCs require a registered agent but not member disclosure. He hit a wall. Renee called me that evening. She said they'd received a scary letter from some company about the house. She said they didn't know who it was or how to deal with it. She asked if I knew anything about real estate law. I said I'd make a few calls. I did not make any calls. I let another week go by. Then Renee called again, and this time she was not asking for advice. She was demanding. She told me she needed money. She said they were going to lose the house. She said it was a family emergency, and I needed to help, because that was what family did. She said I had been distant and unhelpful during the worst months of her life, and she needed to know if I was going to show up or not. I asked her if she remembered what I'd shown her in her kitchen. The printed pages about Devon, the civil suit in Florida, the SEC inquiry. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she didn't see what that had to do with right now. I said it had everything to do with right now. She said that was unfair. She said she and Cliff were victims of a scam, and I was punishing her for her husband's mistake. I told her I loved her. I told her that was not in question. Then I told her I'd be coming over on Saturday, and we would sit down together and talk through everything, calmly and without Cliff interrupting. She agreed. On Saturday, I drove to Briarcrest Landing. I parked the F-150 in the driveway. I walked up to the door in my fishing shirt and my worn-out boots. Cliff answered, and I could see immediately that he had been doing research. His eyes had that look people get when they've been reading things online at 2 in the morning and have arrived at conclusions they're not sure about yet. We sat in the living room. Renee sat in the chair by the window. Cliff sat across from me on the couch. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man who is trying to look calm and is not. He told me he'd been looking into Pruitt Land and Lease. I said that was a good name. He said he couldn't find the members anywhere. He said it seemed like the kind of entity a sophisticated investor would use to obscure ownership. I said a lot of people used LLCs for privacy. He said he'd been thinking about this, about who in their life had the resources and the motivation to be quietly circling their financial situation. He said there weren't many candidates. He said he was starting to wonder if I knew more about their mortgage situation than I was letting on. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Renee. I told her I needed to show her something. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I set a document on the coffee table between us. It was the note purchase agreement, with Pruitt Land and Lease on the left side and the name of the Charlotte servicer on the right. At the bottom, in the signature block, in blue ink, was my name, Ezra Pruitt. I had been using a middle name variation for the entity, the kind of thing Theodore suggested for exactly this reason. Renee picked up the paper. She read it. She set it down. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was something more fundamental than either of those. It was the look of a person who has just discovered that the room they've been standing in is much larger than they thought. She said, "You own our mortgage." I said I did. Cliff stood up. He walked to the window and back. He said this was unbelievable. He said it was manipulative. He said I had gone behind their backs and purchased their debt specifically to hold it over them. I told him that was not exactly right. I told him I had purchased a distressed note from a servicer who was going to foreclose on it regardless, and that if I hadn't bought it, someone else would have. I told him the difference was that I was sitting in their living room and could look them in the eye, which a Charlotte servicing company could not do. Cliff said he wanted to know what I wanted. I told him I didn't want anything from him. I told him I wanted to talk to my daughter. He looked at Renee, and she gave him a small nod, and he walked out to the back porch and closed the door. I looked at my daughter for a long time without speaking. I thought about Beverly, about what she would want me to say, about whether she would have handled this differently, about whether there was a version of this where no one had to sit with the truth this long. I told Renee that I was not there to take her house. I told her that had never been the plan. I told her that I had bought the note because I needed to slow things down enough to have a real conversation, the kind that couldn't happen while she was in crisis and Cliff was in denial, and Devon was still theoretically a person who existed. She asked what kind of conversation. I told her the truth, all of it. I told her about the warehouses. I told her about the original sale and what it had produced. I told her about the holding structure Theodore had put together. I told her the number, the actual number, the 42 million, said it out loud in her living room while the afternoon light came through the window, and her husband stood on the back porch, not knowing that the ground under his feet had shifted permanently. Renee didn't say anything for a very long time. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I told her the truth about that, too. I told her that when Beverly died, and I was figuring out what came next, I watched how people around money behaved, not bad people, not strangers, but people I knew, family I loved, and I saw how the knowledge of it changed relationships before anyone had done anything wrong yet. I told her I had watched her and Marcus grow up, knowing what hard work felt like, knowing that the truck might not start, and the grocery budget was real, and you wore your shoes until they couldn't be resoled anymore, and I thought that was worth more than knowing about the accounts. I told her I had also, if I was being honest, been watching her for the last 2 years. I told her about the birthday dinner and the wine. I told her about the way she'd introduced me, as just retired, to her friends. I told her about the conversation in the hallway where Cliff had asked about my savings, while assuming there were none worth mentioning. I told her I had needed to see, clearly and without my money in the room, what she actually thought of me. Renee was crying by then. Not loudly, just steady. She asked if what she'd seen was the answer. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her that was why I was still here. What happened next took months, and it was not dramatic, and it did not happen in a courtroom. There was no public moment of revelation. There was no villain being hauled away in handcuffs, though Devon was eventually located in South Carolina, and the SEC and the FBI between them made sure he understood what the rest of his years were going to look like. What happened was smaller and harder than any courtroom scene. Cliff sold the second car and took a full-time position with a distribution company in Savannah, the kind of work he had always considered beneath him, and he did it without complaining to Renee about it, which was the first thing he'd ever done that raised him in my estimation. Renee went full-time with the design business and turned out to be genuinely good at it, which surprised her more than anyone. I restructured the note. I didn't forgive it, because forgiveness without accountability is just a different kind of harm. But I set new terms, lower rate, longer amortization, monthly payment they could sustain. Theodore drew up the papers. Cliff signed them at the kitchen table without making eye contact with me, which I understood. The $42 million remained where it was. I told Marcus on a Sunday call, gave him the same full picture I'd given Renee. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, I figured there was something. You always seemed too calm." I laughed for the first time in months. I did not move into a bigger house. I still drive the F-150, though I put new tires on it last spring. I still wear the fishing shirts. I have a tailor in Charleston who has been making me 2 suits a year for 20 years, and they hang in the closet for the 3 or 4 occasions a year that call for them. What changed was simpler than any of that. Renee started calling me on Tuesday evenings, not because she needed something, but to talk. She asks about the warehouses now, asks questions that are real questions, not because she's calculating anything, but because she finally understands that my life has dimensions she never looked at. Last month she drove down on a Saturday, and we spent the afternoon in the garden, and she pulled weeds without being asked, and we talked about her mother, and I told her stories she'd never heard, and she listened to all of them. I think about Beverly when I sit on the porch in the evening. I think about what she would say about all of this. I think she would say I waited too long, and also that I handled it exactly right, because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who could hold 2 true things at once. I am not a man who needs to be celebrated. I never have been. I built what I built because the work itself was the point, because watching a truck leave a loading dock in Macon and end up stocked on a shelf in Richmond was a satisfaction that didn't require anyone else's applause. But I will tell you this much, because you've listened this far, and you deserve the honest end of it. The day Renee sat across from me in her living room and actually saw me, not the F-150 and the fishing shirts and the old rancher house, but the person who had been standing in all of those places for 67 years, that day was worth more to me than any number in any account. You can have all the money in the world and still be invisible to the people who are supposed to know you. Getting seen, really seen, after all that time, that is the only currency that ever mattered.